V-Rising's got a pretty solid and simple pitch. What if a survival crafting game, but you got to be a motherfucking vampire? V-Rising is filled with gothic manors, undead crypts, and all manner of little vampiric touches like an allergy to silver, but ultimately, old vampire tropes are the least important part of V-Rising's DNA. See, this game is made by Stunlock Studios, aka the devs that made Battlerite, and it clearly shows. Carrying forward the same sensibilities from a decade of making PvP arena games, Stunlock's latest title is, in many ways, an outsider's take on the survival genre, one that emphasizes combat and progression instead of exploration. And what they cooked up is both fascinating to dissect and incredibly rad to play. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're reclaiming our dread vampiric domain in V-Rising. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free review copy of this game, so heads up. If you've played a survival game before, the very basics of V-Rising's gameplay are going to feel really familiar. Wake up, make some simple tools, upgrade those tools to copper, and slowly go from some dude squatting in the woods to overlord of a sprawling gothic vampire castle. At this point, the basic survival game setup is fairly well codified, and V-Rising captures it perfectly well here. But that's not all that's going to feel familiar about V-Rising. It's difficult to talk about this game without bringing up Valheim, not just because last year's breakout hit was such a landmark title for the survival genre, but because V-Rising was very clearly taking notes. There's a lot that's been ported over here fully intact, everything from smaller details like how it takes 2 minutes to process materials and the fact you can't fast travel if you're carrying anything actually important, to game-defining ones like the entire basic gameplay loop. V-Rising is a succession of increasingly difficult zones that you explore and slowly level up through by upgrading gear. You walk into a new zone, find its trademark resource, farm it until you have enough to fully deck yourself in the next tier of armor, and then go hunt down a boss that usually unlocks the next zone or resource. But even if it's starting from the same template, V-Rising has tweaked a lot of these different elements to the point where the game emphasizes very different aspects of the survival genre. That core loop, for example, is much shorter and more granular. There are dozens of bosses in the first zone alone, but each one you hunt down will only unlock a new item or two. This surprisingly feels pretty good, since every item still adds something meaningful to the game's base building elements, and the hunt for each boss is one of the game's highlights, so getting to do it more often is hardly something to complain about. It's also helped by the fact that V-Rising's combat is genuinely good. Something that I have never gotten to say about a survival game I've played before. For a lot of survival crafting games, the combat isn't really the point. And with that diminished emphasis, it really shows in the end product. A lot of survival game combat is tedious, clunky, and generally just filled with jank. But it's not so for V-Rising. Bosses all feel unique and have their own tricks to make life difficult for you. Even standard enemies all have their own special abilities, and if you're even on gear, a pack of 4 or 5 guys is still a legitimate threat that can produce a fun, challenging fight. But every attack in the game is dodgeable, so if you don't mind going toe-to-toe with something that can one-shot you, you can eventually topple enemies that you have no right fighting through persistence alone. Compared to an actual ARPG, a genre that V-Rising's combat cuts a little closer to, this game is fairly tame to start. But if your only point of comparison is the other 90% of the genre it's competing in, this game may as well be fucking Devil May Cry. And that's just talking about basic game feel. We haven't even touched on how much more interesting your options to take into battle are. Not only do you get your choice of swords, axes, bows, and the like, but each weapon comes with its own special abilities and game style. The hammer gets a big leaping attack and the bow an AoE area denial ability. And then, entirely separate from your weapon loadout, you get a bunch of spells ranging from frost arrows that freeze opponents, to a big magic parry, to a dash that encourages you to use it offensively since you heal if you follow it up with an attack. Again, for the survival genre, this is virtually unheard of. Instead of just mashing left click repeatedly, you have an actual toolkit of a half-dozen abilities to draw on in any given situation, and every boss you beat expands your repertoire even more. But of course, there's more to survival games than just combat, so how's the base building? V-Rising handles the other half of the formula perfectly fine. It's very well polished, it works exactly like every other survival game, and it is a reasonably fun way to spend your time. But honestly, there's not that much to talk about here either. The main way in which V Rising distinguishes itself is aesthetically, with the whole gothic castle shtick, but for your first few hours, you're not even going to get to enjoy that much. It's practically 5 hours before you even unlock all the necessary equipment to put a roof over your head, and until you can do that, you're basically just building a bunch of material grinders in the middle of the forest. But once you do get a castle fully online and running, it does feel like a genuine accomplishment, and it's suitably imposing looking. Most of the noteworthy adjustments on this side of the game are quality of life improvements. Stuff like, instead of having to babysit every little step of the process, I can just dump 2,000 wood into my sawmills and let them spend an hour chewing through those while I go do something else and hunt down another boss. The entire process has been streamlined and made a little more comfortable, and I think these are all changes for the better. And then there are all the little details inspired by the basic concept. You know, the vampire stuff. There are plenty of little mechanics here, but ultimately a lot of these details haven't been very important. Like, for example, you have the classic vampire weakness to silver, which also happens to be the world's currency. So if you want to go buy something, your money literally starts burning a hole through your pocket. Which is an interesting wrinkle, but the one merchant I've come across was instantly hostile to me. So it's also a detail that's only been relevant for like 5 minutes total in the entire time I've played. The biggest difference is in the day-night cycle. Being a vampire, you burn faster than a marshmallow if exposed to sunlight, which you would think would relegate you to spending half the day pacing in your little fort waiting for the moon to come out. But thankfully, you can hop between spots of shade to still move around and do things during the daytime. You don't want to get into a full-blown fight, but you can do basically anything else, be it base building, resource gathering, or traveling during this time without too much worry. The one big upside is that it makes moving through the game world a little more engaging, but here again, this mechanic doesn't radically change how V Rising plays as much as you'd think. Functionally, there isn't much difference between this and other survival games that make nighttime extremely hostile and dangerous with additional stronger enemies. It's a very different flavor to a very familiar rhythm. Unfortunately, it would be remiss of me not to mention the one other way V Rising embraces wide swaths of the survival genre. Namely, it has a PvP mode along the lines of Rust or Ark Survival Evolved, and this is probably the way this game is intended to be played. Unfortunately for all of you, the idea that someone can delete all my work while I'm off having a life for 24 hours is sheer fucking cancer to me. So I don't have any knowledge of this fairly central aspect of the game. What I can say, however, is that V Rising doesn't particularly suffer from its absence. Little baby PvE servers where you don't have to worry about that are a fully supported option and still perfectly fun. But if you're like me and just tooling around solo, there also aren't many meaningful ways to interact with strangers beyond smacking them. If you don't bring friends, you might as well be playing single player. But alright, we've been talking a lot about V Rising's individual elements and how they compare to the rest of the genre. Let's bring this all together. What do you get out of 5 hours with this game? And I think it's definitely going to take a few hours to really find your bearings in V Rising and discover the game's core loop. Around the 3-hour mark, once I'd gone on 2 or 3 hunts for bosses, was when the game got good for me. That's not to say that the preceding time was a slog, it's just that it takes a little bit before V Rising shows its true colors. Like a lot of survival games, this is a bit of a longer title that's going to take a few dozen hours to see all of its content. But thankfully, it feels good enough so far to justify that time. I've been enjoying it enough that I've been sneaking in extra time beyond my 5 hours, and that's a pretty good sign that this one's a winner. But there is still one sticking point I haven't mentioned yet that you should seriously consider, and that's that base maintenance functions on a real-time clock that's ticking even when you're not playing. Basically, a few elements of your castle require you to feed them consumable materials to continue functioning. Stuff like braziers that keep your starting camp safe during the daytime, and the literal beating heart of your fort that you need to keep anything functioning at all. It's an exceptionally low bar to clear, where you will always have more of these resources than you will need. After playing for 5 hours, I have enough to keep my base going for a full week. But if you're the exact sort of time-strapped player that might not have the free time to indulge this sort of design, aka the exact sort of person this review is meant for, even a PvE server might still be a tough sell. If this is you, it's not the end of the world, but I'd strongly recommend you just sidestep the issue entirely, use a private server that's only active when you are, and play the game solo or with a small circle of friends. To give an anecdote on V Rising, there's a building that straight up tells you the list of boss targets you can potentially tackle and almost exactly what your reward will be for doing it. And then there are two ways you can track down these bosses. You can either see that one is a mining foreman, come to the common sense conclusion that they probably hang out at the copper mine you found an hour back, and go check it out. That's how most survival games would handle that problem. But in V Rising, you can use that same building to get a quest marker telling you exactly the direction to go to track your quarry, and just follow that to the same destination. And looking at this one aspect of the game in micro illustrates pretty clearly the strengths and weaknesses of the game writ large. V Rising is basically Valheim, but gamified. RPG-er, focused more heavily on combat and progression and less on exploration and simulation. There is a long list of activities to do in a very specific gamey way. They come with a lot of streamlined quality of life improvements that make for a shorter, significantly tighter gameplay loop and feature deeper, more dynamic gameplay once you inevitably have to fight something. But the sense of discovery every step along the way, be it figuring out how to find your quarry or the surprise of what goodies you'll unlock once you've beaten them, is largely lost. Whether that's a trade-off you're willing to stomach is largely a personal question, but I will say this. Regardless of preferences, V Rising is a very well-constructed game that accomplishes exactly what it wants to, and it's a game that very much plays to the strengths and sensibilities of the studio that made it. I am personally having a lot of fun with it, and while I think that it might not click with everyone, there's definitely an audience out there for this. Hey, by the way, I've got a Patreon. If you enjoyed the video enough to get all the way here, you should go throw money at it. But thank you for watching all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this review of V Rising, and I'll see you all next time.